the Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me.
Jim Lehman is one person who has been an inspiration to many in the Church of the Brethren. He is a writer and a storyteller and an advocate for social justice. And Jim has been around the block a few times in the Church of the Brethren as well. A few years ago, he wrote about the early Brethren, and I would imagine he has a few things to say about the modern Brethren. Hello, I'm Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. Today, we are so glad to have Jim Lehman with us. Jim, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. Jim, you have done many things in your life. You've been a writer, you've went to seminary, you've written more than one book, you've published a magazine, you've conducted workshops from 45 minutes to a week long, you've raised a family, you've been a husband, and I bet you've traveled a bit. Am I leaving anything out?
It sounds good.
It all sounds good. No? Well, tell me about your growing up. Were you raised a Brethren? Were you born a Brethren?
Yeah, I was raised in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in a congregation in which my grandfather was the elder in charge, and his father before him was the elder in charge. Our family was deeply rooted in that congregation. In fact, just in January, my 93-year-old mother passed away, and we held her memorial service in the church that she had been in since she was born. So the roots go very deep in that part of the country.
Modern people don't live that way. That's an amazing thing to be buried in the, or have your funeral in the church that you were christened in.
It is. It's hard to know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that has passed. I know that having those kinds of roots have been very important to me, even though I haven't lived in Pennsylvania since 1966. When people ask me, where are you from? I always say, well, I've lived in the Chicago area most of my adult life, almost all of my adult life, but I'm really from Lancaster County. Family goes back 8 generations there.
Wow.
And for me, that kind of rootedness gives me a frame of reference from which I can move out into the world. So I guess I'd say that it's unfortunate that more people don't have that kind of a blessing.
Absolutely. Where did you go to college?
Went to Juniata College, Central Pennsylvania. That's one of the Church of the Brethren schools.
Okay. And then you went to a Church of the Brethren seminary.
Well, I did. I didn't go to seminary to prepare for the pastorate. By the time I was a sophomore in college, I'd become an agnostic. I was asking all kinds of questions. And asking those questions didn't leave me with a feeling of guilt. I felt like if God existed, God was appreciative of honest search. But it did raise the question of what to do with these roots, these Brethren roots, this deep connection with the Church of the Brethren. And at that time, Bethany was a place, Bethany is the Church of the Brethren Theological Seminary. Bethany was a place where intellectual inquiry was really valued. And I had a fellowship at the time that would have given me an opportunity. It was called a trial year fellowship from what was then called the Rockefeller Foundation. It's now called the Fund for Theological Education. I could have used that to go to almost any other seminary in the country, but I really felt like I needed to go to Bethany because I needed to make my peace in a more mature way with this business of being brethren and being Christian. And Bethany turned out to be a very, very good experience for me.
So you could be an agnostic and go to a theological seminary.
You could then. I think you still can. I think many theological seminaries welcome a student who's asking honest questions. At least that was the case for me, and Bethany was really welcomed me.
Well, I'm curious, what do you do if you go to a seminary and you don't become a preacher?
Well, that's a good question. By the time I graduated from Bethany, I had made a good bit of progress in, progress is maybe not the right word, I had grown in my faith. I didn't have a clear understanding of everything, but I had a sense that some of these great convictions, great realities of the faith, I could affirm. And at that time, there was sort of an attitude, well, he's a capable young man, we'll get him into the ministry and he'll grow into it. And so I agreed to be ordained. I was called and was ordained, and I served briefly in a parish, but I knew very quickly that I was not really called to be a minister. No pun intended, I was a layman. And so we had moved to Elgin, where I took a job as a youth outreach worker with the YMCA. I'd had a lot of experience working with street kids when I was at Bethany. And so it was while I was getting very active in the local congregation, Highland Avenue Church of the Brethren, that I really came to the conclusion that my calling was not to the set-apart ministry, is a term that's often used. So I gave up my ordination at that point, but not my participation. That was growing.
And you started working with youth in
I did. I was called.
Is it in Elgin?
I got a job with the YMCA to start a youth outreach program. And it was really interesting. The Y at that time, most of their programs were in building. And you had to be a member, so you had to have some money in order to be a member of the YMCA. And but there were some Ys, and the one that I'd worked with in Chicago when I was a Bethany student had this approach that the Y's job was to go out into the community and be with the kids where they were. So that's why I spent a lot of time as a street worker. I would go actually on the street corner with the kids, getting to know them, and some of them were troubled and were in trouble with the law, and so I would go to them with them on their court dates. So Elgin wanted to have a program like this, and was looking for someone who had experience, and so I applied for the job. And in Elgin, the kids who were not in a position to come into the Y were mostly African American kids. So that was the group I worked with. I came to be friends with about 30 African American young people who were high school students, and they would come into the Y once a week, at least once a week, often sometimes more often, and we had an activity program. They named it Black on White, which I always thought was great because they were all black and I was the only white person. And we did a talent show, we did a fashion show, and the kids really had a great time. So that was why I came to Elgin.
So when they became in your group, they could then go to the Y without having to pay for the membership?
They could use some of the Y facilities. They weren't automatically given a membership, but they could use the gym, which for the guys was a big thing because they're really into basketball.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, let me switch to your writing a book.
Yeah.
How did you get interested? Because I think this happened around that same time. How did you get interested in the Brethren history?
Well, I had no interest in Brethren history. When I was at Bethany, I really think, I don't think I took any courses in Church of the Brethren history. And I had always been encouraged to either consider the pastorate or considered going on getting a graduate degree and becoming a college professor. But I had a sense that neither of those were really right for me. Neither was my calling. So I was working in this youth work job, and Wilbur Brumbaugh, some people who are listening to this who have a history with the Church of the Brethren will remember him. He was one of the most talented people ever to work at the general offices in Elgin. He was an editor and a photographer and an artist and a writer. He was editing a curriculum series on Church of the Brethren history. And he came to me and asked if I would write the one for high school kids, because at that time I was working with that age group. Well, I was just turning 30, and it's very common when you're a youth worker at that age to begin moving out of the direct services, the actual working with the kids, and move into administration, because you begin to lose your ability to identify. You're starting to think like an adult rather than like a young person.
And they're starting to see you as an old man, not one of them.
So I was about to move out of youth work, and I hadn't had much interest in Brethren history, so I almost said no to the project. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember why I said yes, but I did say yes. and I set up a work area in the Brethren Historical Library and Archives, which was much different then from what it is now. It was just kind of a dungeon down there. The room hadn't been remodeled, cement floors, open ceilings. Set up a work area down there with a little gooseneck lamp and began to do research. And I loved it. I found myself be intensely interested in Church of the Brethren history, and I also realized that I loved to write. And that was when I discovered that my calling was to be a writer.
How did the book take form? Because I'm noticing that it's in a certain time frame, and there's certain stories that you told. How did all that get conceptualized?
Well, as I got into the material, I started to think that what I wanted to write was not a book just for teenagers, but a book for a general audience. And I talked with Wilbur, and he agreed that that would be the direction to go. And the other thing, I was thinking about my own experience studying history, and I never found survey courses or survey books to be all that helpful. I'd had a very valuable course at Juniata College called Great Epochs of World Culture. Instead of surveying all of Western civilization, we took 4 periods and studied those in depth: the art, the architecture, the philosophy, the political history, and then we had anchor points between which we could fill in the historical development. I found that very helpful. So I decided to choose one decade in the Church of the Brethren's history and focus just on that, hoping that by coming to understand that, the reader might have a sense for how we got from there to where we are now. And I chose the 1840s, which turned out to be a fortuitous choice because in 1851, Henry Kurtz began to publish the Gospel Visitor. Prior to that time, the Brethren were opposed to publications. They were opposed to higher education. Many churches didn't even have church houses. They were home-based church communities. And in 1851, the beginning of publishing opened the doors for tremendous changes in the Church of the Brethren. Schools were started. There was an explosion of publishing, so that by the fourth quarter of the century, there were as many as 30 publications.
Wow.
And the 1840s were that period just before this explosion of change. So it was a good choice because, and that's why I called it the Old Brethren. It gave people a sense for what the church
was
had
like
been.
before.
Yeah.
Had been, yeah. Well, I was noticing just in looking at the chapters, you have something called the Ancient Order of the Brethren.
It's interesting you should pick that chapter. Of all the titles, that's my favorite title because it has this ring, the Ancient Order of the Brethren. But they actually would talk about that. Order was very important, and it meant different things. It meant following the ordinances. The word ordinance has as its base word the word order, and the ordinances were baptism and love feast and anointing, and those were very important. It was very important that the church be conducted in an orderly fashion. There was an order to worship. There was an order to the congregational business meeting, which is called the church council. I don't think brethren were compulsive about the order, but they believed that a life of faith had structure and symmetry, so that word was very important to the brethren of that era.
You also have a chapter in your book about a slave who became a minister.
Samuel Weir. I did.
Tell us about that.
By the way, that chapter is mostly an excerpt from something that was written by Landon West, who was Dan West's father, who was one of the early supporters of, the word would not be integration because that's a 20th century word, but his hope was that African Americans would find a home in the Church of the Brethren. He was one of the people.
And he wrote that in the 1800s.
Yes, he wrote that about Samuel Weir. And he was a man who was taken up and supported by a number of brethren. Another person who was very supportive of him was Sarah Major, who was our first Brethren preacher. So I thought that was an anomaly for the 1840s, but I thought that it gave us a glimpse of some of the things to come, some of the values that were beginning to develop in that period.
Where did you find this history? Where did it come from?
Well, the documents are there.
They're in that archives?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So you had to do a lot of searching through things to decide what to write about.
Well, that was the part that I enjoyed, finding things that I didn't know about. In fact, I think that's what good research is. It's like a treasure hunt. You're trying to find stuff that nobody has found before, or stuff that at least you haven't found before.
I thought the book was very interesting just for that reason, because I don't know much about Brethren history, but each of those chapters is a real glimpse about something that's amazing, really, to read about, how people used to live and believe.
Well, thank you. That was my goal. I wanted to try to take the reader into the experience, what the Brethren had been like at that time.
One of the things that I was also struck, which makes sense when I think about the history, was that you have a chapter about the Brethren who ventured into the West. Mm-hmm. And the West was considered Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois.
That's right. The far western Brethren were in southern Illinois.
Amazing. Well, there's still a lot of Brethren there, but they did go a little farther west.
Well, the Brethren followed the frontier. We were never right on the frontier, but we were behind, and Brethren knew how to find good farmland. And Mennonites did too, so that if you look at the two denominations, there you often find them at the same places. In Kansas, for instance, out in California. The story of the Southern Illinois Brethren is interesting. A man named George Wolfe came down the Ohio River into Southern Illinois in the early 1900s, or 1800s, excuse me, the early 1800s. And some other people came and they started a little Brethren community, and they kind of lost touch with the rest of, it was then called the Brotherhood, the rest of the denomination. And then later in the century, another wave of Brethren came out through the northern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and they came in contact with each other. And some things had changed. The Southern Illinois Brethren had a different mode of baptism. There were considerable debates about whether these people could be considered to be brethren.
And of course, the people who are there first, they thought, this is the way it's supposed to be.
That's right.
We ain't changing.
That's right. And to the credit of the Brethren of that day, they were able to find common ground. And I think that's important for the Brethren today, because we're having trouble finding common ground on matters that are controversial. And the mode of doing Love Feast, it may seem strange to us now to care deeply about how you wash feet, but that was something that was deeply important to the Brethren, to get it right. And they were able to find common ground, so that the far western Brethren eventually were integrated, so that now in Illinois we're all one district.
I'm curious, what do you think the lessons are that we can learn from the old Brethren? Is it that about that order, and is it about those roots and about those traditions?
Well, that's a good question. There are some who would argue that we need to get back to that. That would not be my argument. I think we learn from the way the Brethren were, but my task is not to get back to the life my grandfather had or my great-grandfather, who were plain-coated elders. My task is to find the life that I'm being called to now, and to be informed by the way they lived their life, the way George Wolfe, the way Henry Kurtz, the way the Brethren in the 1840s lived their lives, to be informed by that and learn from it, but not try to replicate it.
You also mentioned that they knew how to reconcile, or they worked at reconciling, and it seems like we could use a little bit of that.
I do believe that we could. One of the things to remember is that in the 1840s, people were really connected with one another. Even if they were in deep disagreement, they were still all agricultural people. Chances are they were distantly related, or they knew each other's family and relatives. So that even though you were in deep discord, you still had a sense of connection with one another. Of course, that broke. In the 1880s, the church split three ways. So even in that era, there were irreconcilable conflicts. One of the things that makes it hard for us today is that we don't have those deep connections anymore. We're more likely to be connected with the people in our own community than we are with the brethren over in Ohio or Indiana or even Southern Illinois in the case of us in Illinois. So it makes it harder. There were some sociological factors that made it easier. So I'm not willing to say that they were better people than we are. There were some things that helped them. But I do think we could learn from, and I wish we had transcripts of the discussions between the Far Western Brethren and the Eastern Brethren. By the way, the Far Western Brethren had become more progressive than the Eastern Brethren.
Even in Ohio, and in Indiana and Illinois.
Well, there was the Northern movement and the Southern movement, and the people who'd come along that Southern route and ended up in Southern Illinois, they were more involved in the civic affairs of their community than the Eastern elders who were back here in Pennsylvania and other parts. So that somehow they found a way to make space for their differences, and I think we could learn from that.
Wonderful. Jim, I wanted to make sure we talked about storytelling, but we also have a message to share about New Community Projects, which is attempting to save this planet and the people on it. Have you ever considered going on a learning tour? There are some wonderful opportunities being planned for 2012 by the New Community Project. Perhaps you thought about going to the Amazon or the Arctic. Here's your chance.
New Community Project is a way of getting up close and personal with our world. Whether on a learning tour to Asia, Africa, the Amazon, Arctic, Central America, or closer to home, the Sustainable Living Homestead in Virginia. New Community Project invites people and communities to think about how we're treating the planet and the people who share it, and the world we're passing on to our children, and what it says about us and the things we value. New Community Project is about creating relationships with our neighbors and the creation around us, and that provide the understanding and sense of community we need to build a better future for our planet and its people. Creating relationships with our neighbors and the creation around us. Check out the website, newcommunityproject.org. The learning tours provide participants with an up-close and personal way to establish relationships with the people whose livelihood is threatened in some way. Here are the learning tours for the coming year. Harrisonburg, Virginia, Ecuador and the headwaters of the Amazon, the Dominican Republic, Denali, Alaska, and Arctic Village, Alaska.
In talking about storytelling, which came first to you, telling stories or writing stories?
Well, writing. I didn't think of myself as a storyteller. A couple things happened. In the early 90s, I published 2 children's books, children's picture books. And I began to get invitations to visit schools as sort of, the visiting author. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I need to do more than simply show up as sort of a celebrity. And I think in our culture we make too much of people. We have a celebrity-oriented culture.
We do.
So I decided to work up some workshops and assemblies. So I began doing this entirely for elementary school kids. And then not long after that, Ken Smeltzer developed this idea to do the Song and Story Fests. And I began to be invited to be one of the storytellers. So I started to develop some additional stories for adults. And so that's how the storytelling came about. So it only indirectly came out of the writing. It came via the children's work.
Where do you get your ideas for stories?
Well, both for writing, particularly writing fiction, and for telling stories, I get them out of my own experience, things that matter to me. Or sometimes I'll tell stories that come from another source. There's a great story. It's sort of like a joke, but it's more than that, where there's a debate between a Jewish peasant and the Pope that I like to tell simply because it's a good story. So I'll sometimes tell stories from other people, but most of the time they come out of my own experience.
You have actually, in your seminars or workshops, taught people how to write stories.
Actually, yes and no. I don't really work on the techniques of writing so much as I work on the structure and elements of a story. So that we'll talk about characterization, and we'll talk about setting, and some of the things you can use, some of the techniques you can use to evoke the setting, to create the place in the story. And then we'll talk about plot development and some of the possibilities for creating a problem, and then some of the ways you can use, things you can do to resolve. And instead of doing a lot of abstract intellectual discussion of those elements, what I usually like to do is just have people brainstorm ideas. And I think when the workshop is at its most successful, the group is coming up with a story, or the elements of the story. We don't actually write it. And sometimes that can be a lot of fun. Sometimes the story elements, because you're brainstorming with a group of people, become kind of wild and wacky. That's one of the things that happens with free association. But the point is to just kind of understand what makes a good story.
Any words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us?
I don't know that I would call it wisdom. I am perplexed by the polarities of our society. Not just the church, but our society. I listen to the political campaigns, and apart from the question of the issues, the virulence with which candidates go at each other, and the way in which one candidate vilifies the other as though he or she is not even a human being, this really troubles me. And we see it not just in our country, but we see it across the world, a kind of fundamentalism that is so sure it's right that it can dismiss the other. And I wonder, we're in this new century and we try to understand what are the issues of the 21st century, but I wonder if that might not be one. And the finding a way to live in peace and understanding with somebody you don't like and don't agree with. I think we're going to have to find a way, not just in this country, but across the world. And I don't have an answer. That's why I don't have wisdom on that, except to say that it must be.
No. Well, thank you very much for being with us on Brethren Voices. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you very much. This is Brent Carlson for Brethren Voices, wishing you peace.